Metro 2033, Dmitry Glukhovsky, Chapter 18, The Authority. They had already noticed his absence and had stopped. A white beam darted about the tunnel. When it fell on him, Artyom raised his hands just in case and screamed, "It's me! Don't shoot!" The flashlight went out. Artyom hurried forward, expecting a dressing down now. But when he reached the others, Melnik only asked quietly, "Didn't you hear anything just now?" Artyom nodded. He didn't want to talk about what he had just seen. He thought it might just have been his imagination. He knew that he had to treat his impressions carefully in the metro. What was it? It had looked like a train racing by, but it couldn't have been. There hadn't been enough electricity in the metro to move the trains for dozens of years. The second possibility was even more improbable. Artyom recalled the warnings of the savages regarding the holy passages of the Great Worm. So the trains don't run anymore, right? He asked the stalker. Melnik looked at him with displeasure. What trains? Once they stopped running, they never moved again until they were ransacked for parts. Do you know something about these sounds? I think it's subterranean water. There's a river quite near here. We passed beneath it. Screw it. There are more important problems. We still don't know how to get out of here. Artyom didn't want to let the stalker think that he was dealing with a madman, so he remained silent and let the subject drop. It was probably the river. The unpleasant sounds of flowing water and the babble of thin, black, tiny brooks along the edges of the rails had disturbed the somber hush of the tunnel here. The walls and arches gleamed with moisture. A whitish film of mold covered them, and here and there were puddles. Artyom had become used to fearing water in the tunnels, and this line made him particularly uncomfortable. His stepfather had told him about flooded tunnels and stations. Luckily, they lay deep or were located far away, so that a disaster was unlikely to spread to a whole branch. The further they moved, the drier it became around them. The tiny brooks gradually disappeared. The mold on the walls was found more rarely, and the air became lighter. The tunnel went down, leaving everything empty. For the umpteenth time, Artyom recalled Bourbon saying that an empty line was most terrifying of all. The others, it seemed, also understood this, and often looked back at Artyom stumbling along last, but having looked him in the eyes, they hastily turned back around. They walked straight ahead the whole time, not lingering at the grates cut away from the side branches and the thick cast-iron doors with locks that could be seen in the walls. Only now was it becoming clear to Artyom just how great were the dimensions of the labyrinth that had been dug into the earth beneath the city by dozens of generations of its inhabitants. The metro consisted of numerous passages and corridors spreading into the depths of a gigantic cobweb. Some of the doors the party passed were open. The beam of a flashlight peeping into them for some seconds showed abandoned rooms and rusty bunk beds. Desolation reigned everywhere, and Artyom searched for even the slightest trace of human presence in vain. Even the metro had abandoned this grandiose structure very long ago. The march seemed to go on forever. The old man was walking ever more slowly. He was all in, and neither jabs to his back nor the foul language of the fighters could force him to pick up the pace any longer. The party had not halted for longer than the half a minute the fighters carrying the stretcher with Anton needed to change hands. Surprisingly, Oleg held on tenaciously. Although he was obviously tired, he didn't complain once. He only sniffled stubbornly, trying to keep pace with everyone. Up ahead, a lively discussion broke out. Peeping from behind the broad backs of the fighters, Artyom understood what was going on. They had entered a new station. It looked almost the same as the previous one. Low arches, columns thick as elephant legs, concrete walls colored with oil paint. The platform was so wide that one was unable to see clearly what was on its other side. A cursory glance suggested that 2,000 people could have waited here for a train. But there wasn't a soul here, and the last train had been sent to an unknown destination so long ago that the rails were covered with a black rust and the rotted ties were overgrown with moss. The station's name, made up of cast bronze letters, caused Artyom to shudder. It was that same mysterious word, Genstaab. He immediately recalled the military personnel at Paulus and the poor lights wandering in the god-forsaken square near the demolished walls of the Defense Ministry building. Melnik lifted a gloved hand. The party froze at the same instant.
Ullman, behind me.
the stalker spat out, and he nimbly climbed up to the platform. The robust fighter who was walking next to him followed the commander. The soft sounds of their stealthy steps dissolved at once in the quiet of the station. The other members of the party, as if on command, took up defensive positions, keeping the tunnel in their sights in both directions. Finding himself in the middle of them, Artyom decided that he might be able to examine the strange station under the cover of his comrades. Will Papa die? He felt the boy pulling on his sleeve. Artyom lowered his eyes. Oleg was standing, staring at him pleadingly, and Artyom understood that the child was ready to cry. He shook his head in a calming manner and patted the boy on the head.
"Is it because I told where Papa worked? Did they hurt him for that?"
Oleg asked.
"Papa always told me never to talk to anyone," he sobbed. "He said that people don't like missile men. Papa said that it wasn't shameful and bad, and that the missile men had been protecting the country, that others just envy them." Artyom glanced at the priest apprehensively, but the old man, fatigued by the journey, had sat down on the floor and was staring blankly into the emptiness, paying no attention to their conversation. Melnik and Ullman returned several minutes later. The party crowded around the stalker, and he put the others in the picture. "The station is empty, but it has not been abandoned. In several places there are images of their worm. And something else. We found a diagram on the wall that was hand-drawn. If one is to believe it, this branch leads to the Kremlin. The central station and transfer to the other lines is there. One of them goes off in the direction of Mayakovskaya. We have to move off in that direction. The track should be free. We won't poke our noses into the side passages." Questions? The fighters glanced at each other, but no one said anything. Then the old man, who had been sitting indifferently on the ground until now, became upset at the word, Kremlin, and began shaking his head and mumbling something. Melnik bent down and tore the gag from his mouth. "You can't go there. You cannot. I won't go to the Kremlin. Leave me here." The priest began to babble. "What's wrong?" the stalker asked with displeasure. "We can't go to the Kremlin. We can't go there. I won't go." The old man kept repeating like a wind-up toy, fidgeting. "Well, it's fine that you won't go there," the stalker answered him. "At least your fellows won't be there. The tunnel is empty, clean. I don't intend to go into the branch lines. It's best that I go straight through via the Kremlin." People started whispering. Recalling the sinister glow on the Kremlin towers, Artyom understood why it wasn't only the priest who was afraid to show himself there. "Everyone," Melnik said, "we are moving forward. There's no time to waste. They have a taboo day today, and there is no one in the tunnels. We don't know when it will end, so we have to press on. Get him up." "No! Don't go there! You can! Aunt!" "I won't go." The old man, it seemed, had gone totally out his mind. When a fighter approached him, the priest slipped out of his hands with an imperceptible serpentine movement, then with feigned obedience froze at the sight of the machine gun muzzles aimed at him. "Well, get lost!" His triumphant laughter turned into a choking wheeze after several seconds. A spasm twisted his body, and he foamed profusely at the mouth. His face became a hideous mask, with his mouth sharply angled upwards. It was the most terrifying smile Artyom had seen in his whole life. "Ready," Melnik reported. He approached the old man who had fallen to the ground and, hooking him with the tip of his boot, turned him over. The stiffened body moved heavily and rolled over face downwards. At first, Artyom thought that the stalker had done it so as not to see the dead man's face, but then he understood the real reason. Melnik illuminated the tightly drawn wires around the old man's wrists with his flashlight. The priest was squeezing the needle he had driven into his left forearm in his right fist. Artyom could not understand how he had contrived to do it, where he had hidden the poisoned dart, and why he had not used it earlier. He turned away from the body and covered young Oleg's eyes with the palm of his hand. The party had stopped dead still. Although the order to move had been issued, not one of the fighters had stirred. The stalker looked them over. One could imagine what was going on in the fighters' heads. Just what awaited them at the Kremlin if the prisoner preferred suicide to avoid going there. Not losing any time on opinions, Melnik stepped towards the stretcher with the groaning Anton, bent down and took one of the handles. "Ullman," he called. After a second of wobbling, the broad-shouldered scout took up position at the second handle of the stretcher.
Submitting to an unexpected impulse, Artyom approached them and grabbed a rear handle. Someone else stood beside him. Saying not a word, the stalker straightened up and they moved forward. The others followed them, and the party once more assumed combat formation. "It's not too far now," Melnick said quietly. "About 200 meters. The main thing is to find the crossing to the other line, then on to Mayakovskaya. I don't know what's further ahead. There's no Tretyak. We'll think of something. Now we have one road. It's impossible to turn off it." His words about the road woke something in Artyom, and he again recalled his own trip. Having thought about it, he didn't immediately recognize what Melnick was talking about, but as soon as he heard the stalker's reference to the dead Tretyak, he started and loudly whispered to him, "Anton." The wounded man. It seems he served in the RVA. So he's a missile man. That means we still will be able to do it. Won't we? Melnick looked over his shoulder at the watch commander on the stretcher. He, it seemed, was really ill. The paralysis in Anton had passed long ago, but now delirium tormented him. His groans were replaced by unclear but furious commands, desperate entreaties, sobbing and muttering. And the closer they approached the Kremlin, the louder the wounded man's cries became, and the more intently he bucked on the stretcher. I said, "Don't argue. They're coming. Hit the ground. Cowards. But just how? Just how are the others? No one will be able there. No one." Anton argued with comrades only he could see. His forehead was covered with perspiration, and Oleg, running alongside the stretcher, took advantage of a short respite while the fighters changed hands to dab at his father's forehead with a rag. Melnick shined his light at the watch commander, as if trying to understand whether he would come to his senses. His eyeballs flashed back and forth beneath their lids, and Anton clenched his teeth and his fists were clenched. He threw his body one way and then the other. Only the canvas strap stopped him from falling from the stretcher, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to carry him. After another 50 meters, Melnick lifted his hand and the party again came to a halt. A crudely painted symbol was shown in white on the floor. The now customary twisting line thrust its thickened head at a fat red mark that cut across the line lying ahead. Ullman gave a whistle. "The red light's lit. It says there's no road." Someone laughed nervously from the rear. "It's for the worms. It doesn't concern us." The stalker cut him short. "Forward." However, now they were moving ahead more slowly. Melnick, having put on the night vision device, took up the position at the head of the party. But it was not only out of caution they had stopped hurrying. At the Genstaab station, the tunnel began to angle more sharply downward, and an invisible but tangible haze of some presence was creeping from the Kremlin. Shrouding the people, it convinced them that something inexplicable, huge and evil was hidden there, in the pitch-dark depths. It was not the same feeling as Artyom had experienced before. It wasn't like the dark vortex that had pursued him in the lines at Sukharevskaya, nor like the voices in the pipes, or the superstitious fear generated and fed by the people in the tunnels leading to Park Pobedy. He felt more strongly that this time something inanimate, but alive nonetheless, was concealed. Artyom looked at the stalwart Ullman walking on the other side of the stretcher. He suddenly really wanted to talk with him. It wasn't important what they talked about. He just wanted to hear a human voice. And why do the stars at the Kremlin glow on the towers? The question had been tormenting him. "Who told you that they glow?" the fighter asked with surprise. "There's no such thing there. It's like this with the Kremlin. Each person sees what he wants to see. Some say that it hasn't been there for ages. It's just everyone hopes to see the Kremlin. They just want to believe that this Holy of Holies was left intact." "And what happened to it?" Artyom asked. "No one knows," Ullman replied, "except your cannibals. I was still young, about 10 years old then, and those who did the fighting say that they didn't want to destroy the Kremlin, so dropped some kind of a secret development on it. Biological weapons. Right at the beginning. They didn't notice it right away and didn't sound the alarm, but when they understood what was what, it was already too late, because it had consumed everyone there. It even swallowed up the people from the neighborhoods. They had been living outside the wall up to then and felt wonderful. So, but how does it swallow? Artyom was not able to shake off a vision of the stars shimmering with the unearthly light on the tops of the Kremlin towers. "And did you know there was such an insect as the doodle bug?"
It would dig a funnel in the sand and climb down to the bottom and open its mouth. If an ant ran past and accidentally touched the edge of the hole, that was it. End of its career. The doodlebug would move, the sand would pour to the bottom, and the ant went straight down, falling into its mouth. Well, it's the same thing with the Kremlin. It stands on the edge of a funnel it can fall into and will suck you down, the fighter smirked. But why do people go inside? Persisted Artyom. How would I know? Hypnosis, most likely. So take, for example, these cannibalistic illusionists of yours. They almost forced us to stay there. So just why, then, are we making our retreat towards it? Artyom asked, with a puzzled look. Those aren't questions for me, but for the boss. But I understand that you have to be outside and look at the walls and towers for it to grab you. But it seems we're already inside. What is there to see here? Melnick turned round and angrily hissed at them. Ullman immediately stopped short and shut up, and a sound his voice had been covering up could be heard. Was it a soft gurgling coming from the deep? A rumbling? It didn't seem to presage anything terrible, but it was persistent and unpleasant, and there was no way of ignoring it. They passed by a trio of powerful pressurized doors arranged one behind the other. All the doors were opened wide, invitingly, and a heavy iron curtain was raised to the ceiling. Doors, Artyom thought. We are on a doorstep. The walls suddenly parted, and they ended up in a marble hall, so spacious that the beam of the powerful flashlights hardly reached the opposite wall. The ceiling, in contrast to other secret stations, was high here, and thick, richly adorned columns supported it. Massive gilded chandeliers turned black by time still flashed brilliantly in the beam of a flashlight. The walls were covered with huge mosaic panels. They depicted an old man with a beard, with people in work clothes smiling at him, and young girls in modest garments and light white headscarves, and soldiers in outdated service caps, a squadron of fighters being carried along the sky, a rumbling tank column, and finally the Kremlin itself. There was no name at this surprising station, but its absence was just enough to understand where they were. The columns and walls were covered with a thick layer of gray dust. It was obvious that no feet had encroached here for decades, and it was strange to think that even the intrepid savages had fled this place. Further on, there was an unusual train on the track. Its only two carriages were heavily armored and painted in a protective dark green color. The windows had been replaced with narrow slits resembling gun slots. The doors, one on each carriage, were locked. It occurred to Artyom that perhaps the inhabitants of the Kremlin had not been able to use their own secret track for escape. They got to the platform and stopped. So this is what it's like here. The stalker lifted his head toward the ceiling as far as his helmet allowed him. How many tales I've heard, but it's not like that at all. Where to now? Ullman asked. No idea, Melnick confessed. We have to investigate. This time he didn't abandon them, and the people slowly moved around altogether. The station resembled a conventional one in some respects. Along the edges of the platform, 2 tracks had been built, and an elongated hall ended in 2 escalators, forever stopped, that exited to magnificent rounded arches. The one closest to them went up, and the other plunged to a quite unimaginable depth. Somewhere here there had to be an elevator. The former residents of the Kremlin would hardly have had, as mortal beings have, 2 minutes to creep down an escalator. Melnick was spellbound, and so were the others, trying to reach the high arches with their beams, scrutinizing the bronze sculptures installed inside the hall, admiring the magnificent panels, and astonished by the grandeur of this station, a true underground palace. They even began to whisper so as not to violate its peace. Looking along the walls with admiration, Artyom completely forgot about the dangers and about the priest who had finished himself off, and about the intoxicating radiance of the Kremlin stars. Only one thought remained in his head. He was trying so hard to imagine how unspeakably beautiful this station must have been in the bright light of those magnificent chandeliers. They were approaching the opposite end of the hall, where the steps of the down escalator began. Artyom wondered what was concealed down there. Another station, perhaps, from which trains were sent directly to secret bunkers in the Urals, or tracks leading to countless corridors of dungeons, a deep fortress.
Strategic reserves of weapons, medicines, and foodstuffs, or simply an endless dual ribbon of steps leading downward as far as the eye could see. Wouldn't that deepest point of the metro of which Khan had spoken be located here? Artyom imagined the most improbable pictures, deferring that moment when, reaching the edge of the escalator, he would finally see just what really was located below. That's why he was not first at the handrail. The fighter who had just been telling him about the doodlebug had reached the arch earlier. Uttering a shriek, he shrunk back in fright. And a moment later it was Artyom's turn, slowly, like certain magical creatures which had been sleeping for hundreds of years, but were awake and flexing muscles that had become numb from ages of sleep. Both escalators began to move. The steps crawled downward with a strained creak. It was inexpressibly eerie. Something here did not add up, did not correspond to what Artyom knew and understood about escalators. He felt it, but was unable to grasp the slippery shadow of understanding by the tail. Do you hear how quiet it is? It's not the motor moving it, you know. The machine room is not working. Ullman facilitated it. But of course, that was it. The creak of the stairs and the grinding of the ungreased gears and all the sounds that the revived mechanism emitted. Was that all? Artyom again heard the disgusting gurgling and slurp that had reached him in the tunnel. The sounds were coming from the depths where the escalators led. He gathered his courage and, approaching the edge, illuminated the inclined tunnel along which the blackish-brown ribbon of steps crawled ever faster. For something like a moment, it seemed that the Kremlin's secret had been opened up before him. He saw something dirty, brown, oily, overflowing, and unambiguously alive oozing through the slits between the steps. It emerged from these slits in short spurts, rising and falling in step along the whole length of the escalator as far as Artyom could see. But it was not a meaningless fluctuation. All these spurts of a living substance were part of one gigantic whole, which was straining to move the steps. And somewhere far below, at a depth of several dozen meters, this very dirty and oily stuff spread freely about the floor, swelling and clearing away, overflowing and quivering, emitting those same strange and revolting sounds. The arch was like a monstrous jaw to Artyom, the domes of the escalator tunnel a throat, and the steps themselves, the greedy tongue of a terrible ancient god awakened by strangers. And then it was as if a hand touched his consciousness, stroking it, and his head emptied, as in the tunnel. And he wanted only one thing, to step onto the escalator and ride below, where the answer to all his questions waited. The Kremlin stars once more flashed before his imagination's gaze. "Artyom, run!" A glove slapped him on the cheeks, burning his skin. He roused himself and was stupefied. The brown slush was creeping up through the tunnel, swelling visibly, expanding, frothing like steaming pig's milk. His legs would not obey, and his flash of consciousness was extremely short. Whatever controlled him set him free for only a flash in order to grasp him firmly and draw him back into the haze once more. "Pull him, the lad first, and don't cry. Heavy, and the wounded guy is still here. Drop it, drop the stretcher. Where are you going with the stretcher? Wait a moment, I'll climb it too. It's easier with two. Your hand, give me your hand, quickly. Mother of God, it's already come out. Tighten it up. Don't look there. Do you hear me? On his cheeks, that's it. To me. That's an order. I'll shoot." Strange pictures were flickering. Green, the side of a rail car sewn with rivets, an inverted ceiling for some reason, then a soiled floor. Darkness, green armor again. Then the world stopped swaying, grew calm, and froze. Artyom raised himself up and looked around. They were sitting around him on the roof of the armored train. All the flashlights had been turned off. Only one was lit, a small pocket light which lay in the center. Its light was not enough to see what was happening in the hall, but something could be heard bubbling, seething, and overflowing from all sides. Someone again was carefully, as if trying by touch to reach into his mind, but he shook his head and some of his fog dissipated. He looked and mechanically recounted the members of the party huddled on the roof. Now there were 5 of them, not counting Anton, who still had not come to, and his son. Artyom dully noted that one fighter had disappeared somewhere, but then his thoughts again faded away. As soon as his head emptied, reason once more began to slide into a turbid abyss. It was difficult to fight it alone. Melnik recognized what was happening, and Artyom tried to grasp this thought. He had to think about whatever he liked, if only to keep his mind occupied. It was apparent the same thing was happening to the others. This is what happened to this trash when it was exposed to the radiation. They were exactly right, biological weapons, but they didn't think what the cumulative effect would be. It's also good that it stays behind the wall and doesn't get out into the city, Melnik was saying. No one answered him. The fighters had calmed down and listened absent-mindedly. Speak. Don't be quiet. This crap will stay in your subconscious. Hey, Oganesian, what are you thinking about? The stalker shook one of his subordinates. Ulman, damn it. Where are you looking? Look at me. Don't be quiet. Sweet. It's calling, the strong Ulman said, fluttering his eyelashes. Just how sweet? Didn't you see what happened to Delyagin? The stalker slapped the fighter on the cheek with all his might, and Ulman's lethargic look brightened. Hold hands. Everyone is to take each other's hand, Melnik cried at the top of his lungs. Don't be quiet. Artyom, Sergei, at me, look at me. And a meter below bubbled and seethed that terrible mass that it seemed already had covered the whole of the platform. It was becoming ever more persistent, and they were no longer able to withstand its pressure. Guys, fellows, don't give in, but press on, all together. Let's sing. The stalker was not giving up, calling his soldiers to order, handing out slaps in the face or bringing them to their senses with light touches. Rise up, huge country, rise up for a mortal fight. He dragged it out, wheezing and out of tune. With the dark fascist force, against their cursed hordes, let noble fury boil up like a wave, Ulman carried on. It seethed around the train with double the strength. Artyom hadn't begun to sing along. He didn't know the words to this song, and anyhow it occurred to him that the fighters had begun to sing, for some hidden reason, about the power of darkness and a boiling wave. No one knew any more words than the first verse and the refrain, except Melnik, and he sang the next quatrain alone, his eyes flashing menacingly and not allowing anyone to be distracted. As two different poles, we are hostile to all. For world and peace we battle, they for a reign of darkness. Almost everyone sang the refrain this time. Even little Oleg tried to echo the adults. The discordant choir of coarse male voices, cracked and hoarse from smoking, resounded, returning in an echo in the boundless dark hall. The sound of the singing soared to the high arches painted with the mosaic, bounced off them, fell and sank into the teeming, living mass below. And although this picture of 7 healthy men perched on the roof of a train and while holding hands, singing these senseless songs would have appeared absurd and funny to Artyom in any other situation, now it resembled more a chilling scene from a nightmare. He really, truly wanted to wake up. Let Noah Wobla fury boil up like a wa'a'ave. A people's war is going on. A cred wa'a'a'ar. Artyom himself, although he was not singing, diligently opened his mouth and rocked in time to the music. Not having caught the words in the first verse, he even decided that it was about either the people living in the metro or about the opposition to the Dark Ones, under whose onslaught his home station was soon supposed to fall. Then in one verse, he heard fascists, and Artyom understood it was about the battle of the Red Brigade fighters with the inhabitants of Pushkinskaya. When he tore himself away from his reflections, he discovered that the choir had fallen silent. Perhaps even Melnik himself didn't know the next verses. Guys, let's do combat, hey? The stalker was trying to persuade his fighters. A combat, my father, combat. You didn't hide your heart behind the guy's back. He had only just started, but then he too fell silent. A stupor enveloped the party. The fighters began to unclench their hands, and the circle disintegrated. Everyone was quiet, even Anton, who had been raving and muttering the whole time, feeling a warm and turbid slush of indifference and fatigue filling the emptiness that had occurred in his head. Artyom tried to push it out, thinking about his mission, then telling himself nursery rhymes as he remembered them, then simply repeating, I think.
think you will not worm yourself into me."
The fighter whom the stalker had called Oganesian suddenly stood up and brought himself to his full height. Artyom lifted his eyes to him with indifference. "Well, it's time for me. Take care," he said, taking his leave. The rest dully looked at their comrade, not answering, only the stalker nodded at him. Oganesian approached the edge and unhesitatingly stepped forward. He didn't even scream, but from below was heard an unpleasant sound, a combination of a splash and a hungry rumbling. "It calls! It calls!" Ullman said in a sing-song voice, and also began to get up. Artyom was spellbound. "I think you won't worm yourself into me." He got stuck on the word, "I," and now he simply repeated it, not even noticing that he was speaking aloud. I. Then he strongly, irresistibly wanted to look down in order to understand whether the heaving mass there was as deformed as it had appeared to him at first. But had he suddenly been wrong about it? Recalling again the stars on the Kremlin towers, distant and beckoning. And here the small Oleg sprang lightly to his feet, and taking a short run, threw himself down with a happy laugh. The living quagmire below chomped quietly, receiving the boy's body. Artyom understood that he envied him and also intended to follow. But several seconds later, as the mass closed over Oleg's head, perhaps at that very moment when it had taken his life from him, his father screamed and regained consciousness. Breathing heavily and exhaustedly, looking from side to side, Anton lifted himself and set about shaking the others, demanding an answer from them. "Where is he? What's happened to him? Where is my son? Where is Oleg? Olejchik?" Little by little, the faces of the fighters began to regain intelligence. Even Artyom began to become conscious. He was no longer certain what he really had seen as Oleg jumped into the seething mass. Therefore, he didn't answer, just tried to calm Anton, who, it seemed, felt in a mysterious way that what had happened was irrevocable. And then his hysterics broke into the numbness felt by Artyom and in Melnik and the others. His agitation and his baleful despair were transferred to them, and the unseen hand, firmly grasping their consciousness, was yanked away. The stalker made several test shots at the bubbling mass, but with no success. Then he told the fighter armed with the flamethrower to remove the backpack with the fuel from his shoulders, and, when told to, toss it as far as possible from the train. Having ordered 2 others to direct their flashlights on the spot where the backpack would fall, he prepared to fire and gave the go-ahead. Spinning in place, the fighter hurled the backpack and almost flew right after it himself, barely managing to hold on to the edge of the roof. The backpack flew into the air and began to fall about 15 meters from the train. "Get down!" Melnik waited until it touched the pulsing, oily surface and squeezed the trigger. Artyom watched the backpack's flight while stretched out on the roof. As soon as the shot rang out, he hid his face in the fold of his elbow and grasped the cold armor with all his might. The explosion was powerful. Artyom nearly flew off the roof as the train rocked. A dirty orange glow of blazing fuel splashing along the platform reached his blinking eyes. Nothing happened for a minute. The squelching and chomping of the quagmire did not weaken, and Artyom was already preparing for it to recover from the annoying unpleasantness and begin to envelop his mind again. But instead, the noise began gradually to move further away. "It's leaving! It's leaving!" Ullman bellowed right beside his ear. Artyom lifted his head. In the light of the flashlights, he could clearly see that the mass, which recently had occupied nearly the whole huge hall, was shrinking and retreating, returning to the escalator. "Hurry!" Melnik jumped to his feet. "As soon as it slides down, everyone behind me, right to that tunnel." Artyom was surprised how Melnik could be so certain, but he wasn't about to ask, having put the stalker's previous indecisiveness down to whatever had been controlling his mind. Now the stalker was transformed. He was again the sober, decisive commander who did not put up with any arguments. Not only was there no time to think about it, but he didn't even want to. The only thing that now occupied Artyom was how to get out of this damn station as soon as possible before the strange being that dwelled in the Kremlin's basements recovered its wits and returned in order to consume them. The station no longer seemed marvelous and beautiful to him. Now everything here was hostile and repulsive. Even the workers and peasants looked down in outrage from its wall panels. They still smiled, but it was strained and sickly sweet. Having jumped pell-mell to the platform, they tore to the opposite end of the station. Anton had come to completely and ran as fast as the others, so that now nothing was delaying the party. After 20 minutes of mad racing through the black tunnel, Artyom began to gasp, and even the others had begun to tire. The stalker allowed them to slow to a quick march. "Where are we going?" Artyom asked, overtaking Melnik. "I think right now we are beneath Tverskaya. We should exit soon toward Mayakovskaya. We'll sort it out there." "But how did you know which tunnel to enter?" Artyom was curious. It was shown on the map we found at Genstaab, but I only recalled that at the last moment. As they arrived at the station, everything flew from their heads. Artyom pondered. Had his delight with the Kremlin station, with the pictures and the sculptures, and its space and magnitude come to nothing? Or was it some trickery evoked by the terrible entity lurking in the Kremlin? Then he remembered the disgust and fear that the station had inspired in him when the drug had dissipated, and he began to doubt that these were his real feelings. Maybe the doodle-bug forced them to feel an irresistible desire to run from there at breakneck speed when they caused it pain. Artyom was no longer sure of his true feelings. Did a monstrous creation of his mind release him, or did it continue to dictate thoughts to him and inspire his emotional experiences? At what moment did Artyom fall under its hypnotic influence, and was he sometimes free to make his own choices? And could his choice ever be free? Artyom again recalled the meeting with the two strange residents of Polyanka. He glanced back. Anton was walking 2 paces behind him. He no longer badgered anyone about what happened to his son. Someone had already told him. His face had hardened and gone dead. His gaze was turned inward. Did Anton understand that they were only a step away from rescuing the boy? That his death had become a ridiculous accident? But it had brought the others through. Accident or victim. You know, we all most likely were saved only thanks to Oleg. It is because of him that you regained consciousness, he said to Anton, not specifying how this had come about. Yes, Anton agreed indifferently. He told us that you served in the rocket forces, strategic, tactical, Anton replied, the Tochka and the Iskander, and multiple fire systems. Smerch, Uragan? Having held back a little, the stalker, who had been listening to their conversation, asked, I can operate those, too. I was a career soldier, and they taught it to us. And everyone was interested in it. Everyone wanted to try it, until I saw what it led to. There was not the smallest sign of interest in his voice, and there was no uneasiness regarding the fact that his secret was known to strangers. His answers were short, mechanical. Melnik, nodding, again moved away from them, going on ahead. We need your help very much, Artyom said, carefully testing the waters. Understand, we have terrible things happening at VDNKH, he began, and he immediately stopped short. After what he had seen in the last 24 hours, what happened at VDNKH, however awful, didn't seem like anything exceptional, capable of overwhelming the metro and finally destroying man as a biological species. Artyom considered this thought and reminded himself that it could be coming from the strange entity. We have some creatures getting through from the surface, he continued, having collected his thoughts. But Anton stopped him with a gesture. Just say what has to be done and I will do it, he uttered colorlessly. I have the time now. How can I return home without my son? Artyom nodded nervously and walked away from the man, leaving him along with his thoughts. Now he felt unclean, seeking help from a man who had just lost a child. He had been deprived of him through his Artyom's fault. He caught up with the stalker again. Melnik was clearly in a good mood. Having left the party stretched out behind him, he was humming something to himself and, seeing Artyom, smiled at him. Listening to the melody Melnik was trying to reproduce, Artyom recognized that very song about the sacred war they had been singing on the roof of the train. You know, at first I decided this is the song for our war with the Dark Ones, he said, and then I understood that it is about fascists. Who composed it? The communists from the Red Line? This song is already about 100 years old, if not 150. Melnik shook his head. They composed it first for one war, then adapted it for another. It's good that it is suitable for any war. As long as man is alive, he will always deem himself to be the light of the world, and consider his enemies as the darkness. And they will be thinking like that on both sides of the front, Artyom added to himself, whatever it means. His mind again flashed to the Dark Ones. Maybe it means that people, let's say the VDNK inhabitants, are the evil and darkness for them. Artyom thought better of it and forbade himself to think of the Dark Ones as ordinary enemies. If one opened the door for them only halfway, nothing would hold them back. So you were saying about this song that it is eternal? Melnick unexpectedly spoke. That dawned on me too. In our country, all eras are much the same. Take people, you won't change them in any way. They're as stubborn as mules. So it would seem the end of the world is already at hand, and you cannot go outside without an anti-radiation suit, and every kind of trash that earlier you only saw at the cinema has multiplied. No, you do not impress them. They're the same. Sometimes it seems to me that nothing has ever changed. Well, I visited the Kremlin today. He smiled wryly, and I was thinking, there's not even anything new there. I'm not even certain when they hit us with this crap. 30 years ago or 300? Were there really such weapons 300 years ago? Artyom was doubtful, but the stalker didn't reply. They'd seen 2 or 3 depictions of the great worm on the floor, but there had been no sign of the savages themselves. The first drawing had put the fighters on their guard, and they'd regrouped in such a way that it was easier to defend themselves. But the tension had dissipated after they'd encountered the third drawing. They weren't jabbering nonsense. Today was a holy day, and they stay at the stations and don't go into the tunnels, Ullman noted with relief. Something else occupied the stalker. By his calculations, the missile unit was very close by. Checking the hand-drawn map every minute, he absently repeated, "Somewhere here. Isn't this it? No, not that corner, but where is the pressurized gate? We ought to be approaching it already." Finally, they stopped at a fork. To the left was a dead end with a grill, at the end of which they could see the remains of a pressurized gate, and to the right, as far as the light of the flashlight could reach, there was a straight tunnel. "That's it," Melnick determined. "We're there. Everything tallies with the map. There, behind the grill, the tunnel has collapsed like at Park Pobedy, and that must be the passage into which they took Tretyak. So," illuminating the map with his pocket flashlight, he thought aloud, "the line goes directly from this fork to the division, and this one to the Kremlin. We came from there, right?" Then he climbed behind the grill with Ullman, and they wandered around the dead end for about 10 minutes, inspecting the walls and ceiling with the flashlight. "Okay." "There's a passage in the floor this time, a round sort of top, similar to a sewer manhole," the returning stalker reported. "Everyone, we are there. Take a break." As soon as everyone had removed their rucksacks and had sprawled out on the ground, something strange happened to Artyom. Despite the awkward position, he fell asleep instantly. Either the fatigue accumulated in the last 24 hours had taken its toll, or the poison from the paralyzing needle was producing some side effects. Artyom again saw himself asleep in the tent at VNDKH. As in his earlier dream, it was gloomy and abandoned at the station. Artyom knew beforehand what would happen to him now. Already accustomed to saying hello to the little girl who was playing, he didn't ask her about anything, heading instead directly toward the tracks. The distant cries and entreaties for mercy didn't frighten him. He knew that he was seeing the unwelcome dream again for another reason, one that concealed in the tunnels. He was supposed to uncover the nature of the threat, reconnoiter the situation, and report about it to his allies from the south. But as soon as he was shrouded in the darkness of the tunnel, his confidence in himself and in the fact that he knew why he was here and how he had to go on vaporized. He was as frightened as when he went beyond the limits of the station alone for the first time. And exactly as then, it wasn't the darkness itself nor the rustle of the tunnels that scared him, but the unknown, the inability to foretell what danger the next 100 meters of the line concealed. Vaguely recalling how he had behaved in previous dreams, he decided not to give in to fear this time, but to go forward until he met the one who was concealed in the dark, waiting for him. Someone was coming towards him, not hurrying as he was, not walking with his cowardly, slinking, short steps, but with a confident, heavy tread. Artyom stopped in his tracks, catching his breath. The other one also stopped. Artyom promised himself that he wouldn't run this time, regardless of what happened. When, judging by the sound, only about 3 meters of darkness separated them, Artyom's knees shook, but somehow he found the strength to make one more step. But, feeling a light flutter of the air on his face as someone approached, Artyom couldn't bear it. Flinging out a hand, he pushed the unseen being away and fled. This time he didn't stumble, and he ran for an intolerably long time, an hour or two, but there was no trace of his home station. There were no stations at all. Nothing at all. Only an endless, dark tunnel, and this proved to be even more terrible. "Hey, that's enough of a nap. You'll sleep through the meeting." Ullman pushed him on the shoulder. Artyom roused himself and looked guiltily at the others. It appeared that he had dropped off for only a few minutes. They were all sitting in a circle. In the center was Melnik with the map, pointing and explaining. "Well," he said, "it's about 20 kilometers to our destination. If we keep up a good pace and nothing gets in our way, it's possible to make it in half a day. The military unit is located on the surface, but there is a bunker under it and the tunnel leads to it. However, there's no time to think about that. We have to split up." He looked at Artyom. "Are you up?" "You are returning to the metro. I will appoint Ullman to look after you," he said. "The others and I are going to the missile division." Artyom was on the verge of opening his mouth, intending to protest, but the stalker stopped him with an impatient gesture. Leaning towards the heap of rucksacks, Melnik started to distribute the supplies. "You take 2 protective suits. We have 4 left, and we don't know what it will be like there. There's 1 radio for you and 1 for us. Now, the instructions. Go to Prospect Mir. They are waiting for you there. I have sent some messengers." He looked at his wristwatch. "In exactly 12 hours, go up to the surface and look for our signal. If everything is okay and we are on the air, we'll move to the next stage of the operation. Your mission is to find the best way to the botanical gardens and then to get up high in order to help us direct and correct the fire. The Smerch has a limited destruction area and we don't know how many missiles are still there. And the gardens aren't small. Don't worry," he said to Artyom. "Ullman will be doing it all. You are there as company. We have use for you too, of course. You know what these dark ones look like? The Ostankino Tower is very suitable for guidance. It's wider in the middle. There was a restaurant there. They served tiny sandwiches with caviar there at prices that were out of sight. But people didn't go there because of them, but for the view of Moscow. The botanical gardens can be seen clearly from there. Try to get to the tower. If you can't get to the tower, there is a multi-story building alongside, sort of white, shaped like the letter P, and almost uninhabited. So, this is a map of Moscow for you, and this one is for us. It's a shambles there around the squares. You simply look and communicate. The rest, follow us. It's nothing too complex," he assured them. "Questions? And if they don't have a nest there," Artyom asked. "Well, we can't do the impossible." The stalker slapped his palm on the map. "And I have a surprise here for you," he added, winking at Artyom. Reaching into his backpack, Melnik took out a white polyethylene bag with a worn colored picture on the side. Artyom looked inside and took out the worn passport and the children's book with the cherished photograph that he had found in the neglected apartment at Kalinsky inside. Having raced after Oleg, he had left his treasures at Kievskaya, and Melnik had gone to the trouble to collect them and carry them with him all this time. Ullman, sitting alongside, looked at Artyom with a puzzled look, then at the stalker. "Personal things," Melnik said, smiling. Artyom wanted to thank him, but the stalker had already got up from his seat and was giving orders to the fighters going with him. Artyom went up to Anton, who was absorbed in his own thoughts. "Good luck." Artyom extended his hand to the lookout. Anton silently nodded, putting his rucksack onto his back. His eyes were totally empty. "Well, that's all. We won't say goodbye." "Note the time," Melnik said. He turned and, without saying another word, was off.